Welcome to Recross the Paths. My name is Cade, and today my guest is Jake. Welcome, Jake.
Hey, Cade. Thanks so much for having me on here.
I'm thrilled to have you here. Many folks that will know you will not know you as Jake. They will know you instead as Deinonychus.
Yes, I do go by Deinonychus on most cube spaces, and frankly, I don't spend much time on the places that I don't go by that anymore.
So Deinonychus is a type of dinosaur. So I feel obligated to ask, what is your second favorite dinosaur, presuming that Deinonychus is your favorite?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm gonna have to go with the T-Rex. I know that that is a very probably overhyped answer to the question, but I grew up around Boston, and my love of dinosaurs really started in going to the Boston Science Museum and seeing their gigantic T-Rex skeleton that they've got there.
Oh man. Well, I think that also humanizes you a little bit too, where here I have this fancy obscure dinosaur as my favorite, but then my second is also you know, the best one for every 3-year-old too.
That's a good point.
So Jake, you have designed a number of different cubes, perhaps none as well known as Bodleian Cube. Uh, to get us started, would you give us an elevator pitch for Bodleian?
Yeah, so Bodleian Cube is all about showcasing iconic and powerful cards, but it's got an emphasis on strategies that make cards more than the sum of their parts. It's really designed to let these iconic cards shine alongside archetypes that sometimes would suffocate these more niche cards when we try to maximize individual card power. And I guess it's also important to say that everyone starts with a Cogwork Librarian in the drafts. I find that this really encourages people to speculate on cards that you need to find other pieces in the draft.
Yeah, one of the nice pieces in your overview, which is beautiful, by the way, there's a lot to explore in the overview alone. One of the things you note is that you're trying to build an environment where, quote, card combinations are greater than the sum of their parts, end quote. That idea that you don't have as many just game-ending haymakers, but a lot of things that are pieced together to make something better. How do you go about building that?
Yeah, so it's definitely a challenge, especially in the eternal cube space. And so the main knob that I like to control there, I always reference the card Yawgmoth Thran Physician, both because it's one of my favorites, but also because I think it's a great example of what the power ceiling cards in an environment like this need to look like. So Yawgmoth is a strong card on its own. But when you start to combine it with pieces like, the new Forsaken Miner being a great example, all of a sudden you have black, target creature gets -1/-1, draw a card, you lose a life. And you can do that as many times as you want because Yawgmoth is committing a crime. And so that's the kind of thing that even when some of Magic's most powerful cards are there, people want to go for that and build it because it's very good. And alongside that, you need to make sure to use another 4-drop, let's say Minskin Boo. You can't have those in the cube. Minskin Boo really does not care what your deck is doing. It's going to do 4+ damage per turn, draw you cards, and end the game. You could be blue-white control, and you're still supposed to put Minskin Boo in your deck. And sometimes you're just going to play it on turn 4, and now you're the beat down. And if you've got cards like that, no one's trying to draft any kind of synergy between stuff.
Well, yeah, and with a card like Yawgmoth, yeah, as powerful as the card is, it does require other pieces to actually shine to its fullest potential.
Right, exactly. And so, you know, the line is always tough there, and there's definitely been plenty of tweaking in cards that I've cut for being too individually strong, but I'm always trying to push that line of what kind of interesting and powerful cards can I fit in there while still having people go for these more synergistic decks.
So another piece of your overview that I wanted to highlight here is the idea that you want games to be fun even when you lose them, which is a great idea in principle. What does that look like in Bodleian?
This is something I spend a lot of time thinking about. To me, what that looks like is there's lots of, quests you can kind of do on your deck or dreams you could live. And so I think when a player gets to do some of those things and they get there on those things, they just can't quite win overall. that's still fun. They still feel like they got to do something there. And so you want to give the players those dreams to chase, but I think you also have to be really mindful of the ways that decks win the game. Players particularly don't like losing to things that do the same thing every turn. So whether that's a planeswalker like Vivian Monsters Advocate, which
Mm,
just spits out a 3/3 token every turn, and the game sort of just becomes okay, can I beat a 3/3 with their choice of keyword every single turn? Or recurring nightmare with Atraxa and Ashen Rider, just sort of destroying their best two permanents and making them draw a bunch of cards every turn. Or even on the lower power side, you compare Soul Herder and Mole Drifter together,
sure.
and while it's a classic combo, it sucks to lose the game to just your opponent slowly drawing two cards every turn and then hitting you with a 2/2 flyer in the air. So if we don't give the players ways to win like that, and we also give them dreams to chase, I think that both of those things make games more fun to lose.
I remember watching a game at CubeCon where somebody had Riftwing, Cloudskate, and Soul Herder, and they were handing their opponent back a land every turn.
Yeah, and that's a great example of exactly what we're talking about here. In a cube where that works, right? There's not enough removal to deal with the Soul Herder, or the opponent just can't go over the top of that. Like that's pretty miserable. No one is coming out of the game saying, "Man, I really had fun." While they bounced every single one of my lands to my hand.
Well, you've created an environment that other folks have seemed to really enjoy, myself included. I've had privilege to engage with this online in the past, um, and as popular as this cube is, there are several clones of it. You've had privilege to travel to a number of different events. I imagine you receive a quite a lot of feedback about your environment.
Yes, absolutely. And maybe I shouldn't have, said oof at the beginning right there. I love getting feedback on the cube.
So starting with broad brushstrokes, because I think that this is something valuable for us to talk about. What does feedback you receive on a cube like this look like?
So I guess let's start with, you're right. In June, I absolutely felt very lucky to have the privilege to bring this cube to a couple different events. It was at both California Cube Chance and Boston Cube Party. And so, yeah, I got probably more feedback on this cube in the last month than I have ever in any other period of time in its existence. And so I think that feedback comes in a lot of different forms. Some of it comes in describing experiences that people had, and some of it comes in suggestions for changes to the cube. Those tend to be the two most common things that a drafter is going to offer you.
Do you find that comes in the form of talking about particular cards, a little more broad about themes, about decks? Where does that tend to land?
So I would say it's actually pretty all over the place in terms of some people will focus in on cards, some people will focus in on decks, some people focus in on patterns. And interestingly, I think really when it comes to suggestions about those things, oftentimes a person might say any of those things and really it's all the same feedback. You just sort of have to pare it back to what the actual feedback is from that drafter.
Yeah, and I think that we definitely want to dive into how to peel back those layers of how to interpret that. I did want to ask first, do you find that most folks who are providing feedback are doing so with the expectation of change, or do you think a lot of it is just voicing ideas?
So that's a great question. I think some people do give feedback with the expectation of change, and some people really are just, trying to help. That being said, I think the feedback that people give when they are just trying to help can sometimes be more helpful. I think if you're giving feedback expecting the cube curator to make a change, that can add a layer of tension to the feedback. Not, this is cube feedback. It's not, ultra serious or anything like that. But when someone really wants you to make a change and is pushing really hard for it and, is, maybe at an extreme upset that you're not considering making that change, that's not really a positive experience for anyone involved.
I think there have been folks far wiser than I that have suggested such metaphors as players being like patients and curators being like doctors, where you're trying to make sense of their commentary in a way that you can act on. But in it sounds like in not all cases are those things that you want to act on.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. And I love the patient doctor analogy where, the players, I truly do believe, know best what happened and how it made them feel, which are their symptoms, and that designers have to interpret what happened and how that made their players feel to figure out both if there's a problem and if so, what that problem is, which is the diagnosis.
And I imagine that this is something that most players are going to provide feedback based on what they perceive a context to be or what they imagine a context is supposed to be rather than what you've actually put together.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I think there's two factors that are really at play there. I think the first is that unless you also curate a cube, all of your experience evaluating magic is from the perspective of being a player. So you're going to give feedback in the way that you would think about how you would tune your deck. And while that can be useful, that's not always the same as how you're going to tune an environment.
With that in mind, how do you apply a lens that gets to the heart of the question we mentioned earlier, which is what does somebody providing thoughts or feedback actually mean? How do you get to the heart of what they're after when they provide something that's maybe off base from what you've set out?
Yeah, so I think we should go through an example together of this, and I think that might answer the question
Absolutely.
better than just the lessons up front.
Let's do it.
So I think we should start on the feedback side, right? So I think good feedback, really comes in the form of a good description of what happened in their games with their deck and how it made them feel. But I don't necessarily think that's how a lot of our feedback comes in. So let's say we got some of the following feedback. You need to add more life gain to this cube. Um, you need to cut Ragavan from this cube. You should cut some shock lands and add some original dual lands to this cube, right? So here what we actually have is a solution to an issue that the player thinks that they've diagnosed, which they're offering to be helpful, right? They're interested in helping. People don't give feedback on cubes that they don't like. If they really don't like a cube, they're just gonna, you know, not offer you feedback to help mostly.
I I suppose they will give one very clear type of feedback.
Yeah, that's true. If someone says like, "Man, I hate this cube," that's gonna happen. Not all cubes are for all people, but the rest of the feedback probably not too useful at that point.
But I certainly get your point that a player offering feedback is doing so because they care about the environment or the designer or both.
Right. And I think that's broadly true of how humans give feedback for the most part. If someone is trying to give you constructive feedback and they're doing it in a reasonable way, it at least means that they're interested in helping you.
So you were giving these examples. So looking at, say, more, this cube needs more life gain.
Right. And so, you always want to ask the player when they're saying this, what happened that makes you feel that way? All of these things, right? Using my cube as an example, might be that they have decided they think aggro is too powerful in this cube. That's the issue that they believe they've diagnosed. But I think we still need to peel it one more layer back, which is what happened to them. And so let's say we do that, and now the player says, my control deck got crushed by the Boros aggro deck. You know, one game they played Ragavan. I didn't have a turn one answer, and it took away the game. In the second game, I managed to stabilize with the Wrath, but they top decked Hellrider, and it killed me. I found that pretty frustrating because I thought my deck was good, but it just didn't feel like we were playing on the same playing field. And so that's great feedback, right? We've dialed it back to, we know what happened, and they've given us feedback on some specific cards, and we know how they feel about it. And so, when they said, "Oh, hey, you should have more life gain," it's like, well, that's actually, again, reasonable feedback when you're thinking about it from a deck building perspective, right? If they had had a life gain creature, they may have won the game that Hellrider killed them in, and then they wouldn't have had this experience. Doesn't necessarily mean it's the right solution, but I think that's a great example of how someone can say something like you need more life gain, and really this is the experience that they're getting at, and that's the feedback that you want to be able to file away.
So then when you look at that and you see the experience, you can then think about it from the tools and the context and the environment that you're working on to say, how would I approach a problem like this? And maybe consider the one that they provided, but looking at it from the perspective of the problem rather than the proposed solution.
Absolutely. And so, to kind of give my thought processes on this example from the other side, right? So we've pared down this feedback to, what actually happened to them. And so let's consider a couple things that I would consider when we're thinking about this. So you're not always going to know this, but keeping player skill in mind when you're dealing with feedback is important. And I don't necessarily mean how good that particular player is. I mean relative to their opponent when they played this. The best player in your local play group saying they think something is too good, spoiler, most of the things they play are going to do really well. They're the best player in your group. If there's a huge skill disparity in a matchup, I'm much less likely to believe that the environment is truly at fault for what's going on
Mm.
there than if it's, players I know of similar skill. You're not always going to know that, but it is something to keep in mind because it can really mess with the rest of your ability to read this. But let's say, maybe these players are, we know they're of equal skill or we don't know. So I'm going to look at their deck. I'm going to ask them if they have a deck picture. And so maybe in this case, right, they have a, weirdly high curving deck that doesn't have a lot of cheap answers. Or we know the person passing to them was in, let's say they were Rakdos and this was a Grixis control deck. So we know that a lot of their removal got scooped up and, they weren't in a great seat to be there. These are things I'm going to keep in mind because, this isn't a great example of what I think a control deck has the capability of being in the format. So we don't want to make any sweeping changes on it. Let's say, okay, deck looks solid. What's next here? It's like, well, if the deck looks solid and this experience happened, then, it's really good feedback to have. So then, first things first, I'm going to file that away because I think if you get a lot of feedback that's ultimately coming from a similar place, that's something that you're going to want to be more inclined to act on. And that's why it's so important to make sure that you go from you need more life gain to, my control deck got crushed by the aggro deck as actual feedback. Because again, the next person might tell you that, if they had triomes, their deck would have worked. And what that actually means is, their painful mana base cost them life and so aggro beat them. And those might seem like different pieces of feedback, but really they're all getting at, aggro is performing very strongly against other decks in the format, which is really useful feedback to have.
How often would you expect to hear a piece of feedback before it starts registering as, hey, this should probably be acted on? Is it a first time thing or does it vary case by case?
I think it has to be case by case. I caution designers against reacting too quickly to any one piece of feedback. The main case where this is different is where I witness something. There are cases where I have seen a card just brutalize someone in a way that struck me as, really unfun. And that card has made its way out of the cube pretty quickly. But when someone tells me, hey, I think aggro is too good in the list, it's something I'm listening to, but it's, I'm not going to immediately, cut the best aggro one drops or start buffing sweepers against it right away. Because I think the other piece here that's important is so the player had a problem in this case. But the next question you actually have to ask yourself is that supposed to be a problem in this environment? Players have to lose games. In fact, one loses every single game of Magic that gets played in your cube, and part of your job as a designer is to decide how people lose games. So if we go back to life gain example, let's say a big creature like Aquasauts or Baneslayer Angel, that's going to improve the control matchup against aggro.
By quite a lot, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. The red aggro deck is going to probably not be able to beat a 5 toughness first strike lifelinker. But there's other costs to that in the format. And so you can't, as a cube designer, just look at how that matchup goes. And so you could realize this is a situation where the control player is supposed to lose. From that board state, the control deck being able to come back would have outsized consequences in other matchups in the format, which would make it less fun on average for players of the cube. There have to be situations that people can't win from. And from a player perspective, you want to be able to win from any situation. But again, that's a big difference between curating a deck against other decks versus curating a cube where you have to advocate for all decks within the format.
I love that. That's such a great idea. And choosing how people lose does sound a little bit grim in a way, but I think there's a real I don't know, there's a real art to that that I imagine is very difficult to pin down in some cases.
Yeah, and it ties back into what we said about having fun while losing, right? In some regards, choosing how people lose gives you an opportunity to make it more fun than it would otherwise be. I would always rather lose to someone doing like a crazy hit off of a Winota than getting strip mine locked out of the game. Just as two, extreme examples. And Winota can be a swingy card, but there are a lot of cool story moments that happen out of it too, and I definitely value that.
It's very true.
And the control aggro matchup, you're never going to be able to say, here's the exact percentage I want, this deck to beat this other deck. There's way too many factors at play, but it's okay for decks to have some matchups that aren't good in a cube. That's, in fact, I think it's healthy. I think if all the decks have really medium matchups against each other, that can be really good if you want to push skill testing formats to their maximum. But I think good bad matchups are also really good for accessibility to new players, because the new player is going to have a tough matchup even in the medium matchups. So when they get a really good matchup and they take a win off someone more experienced, that's such a huge positive for getting people to want to come back to your next cube night.
Absolutely. And for most cubes, they're not such strict decks so much as themes that people are putting together, or maybe just synergy packets or something like that. So it would be almost impossible to try and fine tune every match to be even anyway.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case.
So I wanted to circle back to something you said about being, or rather not being reactive to feedback too quickly, not just jumping on that. Do you think that calculus changes when you don't get to draft your cube as frequently?
So, coming from the perspective of someone who now gets to draft their cube much more than I used to, it definitely is tough. If you get to draft your cube, say, every other month or something like that, you don't get a lot of experiences with it. And so it can be tempting to really act on that feedback. So the answer, for me is I get it. Having been there, there were times when I was more reactive with the feedback that I got, because you want to keep tuning things towards being in a good place. And I think the bright side is if the core of your design is solid, the type of changes we make here probably impact the cube less than we want to believe that they do as designers, which in this case I think is a good thing. If you're making some tweaks, kind of chasing your tail on feedback after every draft, if it feels different, that can work for you as long as, it's still a fun gameplay experience, which broadly speaking, I bet it is. If you're listening to this podcast and making tweaks to your cube, I bet you're an involved enough cube designer that your cube is pretty solid.
So if anybody needs that recording as like your alarm in the morning to know that, here's your little encouragement today. It's just Jake telling you you're doing a good job.
And I believe that they are. But that said, I do think it's really important that designers can entertain feedback without accepting it as true. That's really core to the improvement process of any cube. If you hear feedback and you immediately feel like you have to change your cube as a result of it, breathe, take a step back, think back to times when your cube was far less well designed than it is right now. You know, all cubes started somewhere. And I also want to caveat here that if this is like the first draft of your cube, make changes with prejudice and quickly. You know, the more established a list is, the more I think inertia it should have before you start taking in feedback to make sweeping changes. If it's the first draft of a cube and you just think, wow, what was I thinking putting this card in? It's way too good. Trust yourself there. It's the first draft. Make a lot of changes.
Absolutely. As you've received some thoughts from players that you may not agree with, do you find that it's useful to defend your position? Like, is it something that you have to verbalize how that doesn't align with your goals, or is it something that's a little more like Tai Chi, where you want to flow with that idea and kind of deflect and move past?
I think it really depends on both the feedback giver and the feedback. I, like to discuss with people, and if people are willing to have a, good faith discussion about it, I'm always willing to sit down and have that. I think for me, the biggest thing to keep in mind is that if someone disagrees with you about something and they've offered the feedback, and you disagree with them, you don't actually have to convince them. It's your cube, you're the designer of it. I want to listen to that feedback, but I don't go into all of those discussions feeling like I need to have the other person agree with whatever I'm disagreeing with that they've given me feedback for.
What kind of feedback do you find the most helpful? And is that the same as what you want to hear?
Yeah, so I'm always interested in feedback on new cards. I love when a player sits down and say, "Hey, this card from the last set that you put in, here's this awesome story from it," or "Here's this absolutely horrifying thing that I did to someone with it, or someone did to me with it." Both of those are great because the release schedule is pretty intense. I like to, sneak in cards that I feel like fit my design, and so getting that feedback is great. But I also, I want to know those specific experiences and how they made people feel more than anything else. I want to know if this was exciting, if you won but you thought it was boring. These are the kind of things that really matter, right? If you're bored and you won, that's really powerful feedback relative to just this card was good and I won with it. So this is a really specific one, but one of the amazing things about getting to meet so many of my cube designer friends at Boston Cube Party and at California Cube Championships was getting to interface with some other great designers who are interested in trying the cube. And when someone sits me down and they say, "Hey, I think that this card is really too much or really struggling to get there. Let me lay out for you, why that is." And they come at it from the perspective of, being a fellow designer. That is really helpful. We all have some blind spots in our design, and you know, this card sucks isn't good feedback, but someone who can say, "Hey, I actually drafted your cube twice during this event. Like, I'd love to talk about, this specific thing and try to figure out like what's going on with it because, I was a little confused, or, every time I saw this resolve, like it never got beaten. And so I think this is something you might want to keep an eye on."
So, how can we give better feedback to other people as we play their cubes based on what we've talked about here?
Yeah. So if you are interested in trying to get better feedback, I always want to say, first, start by telling them if you had fun. When someone says, "Hey, I really enjoyed this, but you know, I wanted to give you this piece of constructed feedback too," or "Here's this really awesome story that happened." I think it just, it gets us on the same page that we're all excited about the environment and we want to get started. I think, designers just really like being told that their cube is fun, right? That's why we build cubes. We want people to have fun playing them. But then get into your symptoms. So, and a great example from Boston Cube Party that someone gave me on my own cube. They had actually taken some pictures of some various board states over the course of a couple games. They really wanted to talk about how they'd noticed that green decks had these huge board states and were prone to stalling out. And a couple, specifically some of the vigilance 4 toughness creatures were very prevalent amongst these things. And so they said, "Hey, Cube was a lot of fun. This is something that I noticed. Hey, do you want to talk about it some more?" And so then after sort of presenting these symptoms that they saw, they even had some thoughts about things that they thought might cause that. So they talked about these above rate creatures. With vigilance, they talked about a couple value creatures that they felt made the board bigger but didn't progress towards an end state. And all of this was couched with, here's stuff that could be contributing to this. And so I just thought this was an awesome feedback. And this person wanted to talk for a really long time about this, and I was really appreciative of it because I really understood both what had happened and then some of their thoughts as a designer about how they might go about making tweaks to fix it. And last but not least, understand the goals of the cube that you're giving feedback on. This one's really hard, and I don't expect necessarily the average player of a cube at a cube night to be able to do this one. But, a good friend of both of ours, Greg or Dinrova Horror, is excellent at this. He always gives feedback that helps the cube be more what it's trying to be rather than make it something that appeals more to his style of magic.
Mm.
And that, I think, is the gold standard for feedback.
Most designers are also pretty apt to tell you about the context of their own cube if you ask, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And sharing that context is awesome. But there can be a tendency to say, oh, I like Magic in XYZ ways. And so my recommendation is like, don't run the cards that don't do that. And if the person's goals say, I want Magic to be XYZ, and you're saying, here's how it could be more XYZ, that's great. But if you're saying, I actually like ABC, do ABC instead of XYZ, you're kind of telling them to do a different cube, which can only go so far in terms of its usefulness.
So, Jake, if we were to try to summarize this down into just a few quick bullet points about giving good feedback, how should we parse that down?
Tell people what happened and how it made you feel, and try to give feedback that helps their cube be what it's trying to be, not the type of Magic that you like best.
So then, in a similar vein of summary, how would you think about receiving feedback as a designer? What's a good way to think through that?
Yeah, let's keep the doctor patient analogy in mind here. You have to recognize that your players do know what happened better than you do, but that is your job to come up with how you want to fix any problems that you do figure out are there. I think be able to entertain people's feedback without accepting that it must change. And I haven't gotten to say this one yet. Don't sweat the Darwin Award decks. Like sometimes someone's gonna come in and they're gonna just be like, I tried to do a triple backflip off of like a 3-story building and I like landed and broke both my legs. And you can't be like, how do I design my cube so that can't happen? Like you just gotta say that happened. Like it doesn't matter what I would have done as a designer. Like that deck was gonna be terrible.
But no, that makes sense. Where you want the expectation to be: is this something that can actually be accomplished, or are we trying to wave a magic wand here?
Exactly. And you just can't worry too much about those circumstances, and being able to just smile, think that's a really funny story. I can't wait to tell people about this deck is going to be much healthier for you than trying to figure out, how do I stop someone from splashing a quadruple pip, off color card in their deck.
But I guess at the heart, just recognizing that there are some dreams that are just dreams.
Yes, there are some dreams that are just dreams, and sometimes your players are going to cook up nightmares. You can't stop them. One other factor I think people should keep in mind when it comes to cube feedback is that the feedback is always going to come from the context that the players are most familiar with. So this was something that I had to get used to with Bodleian Cube, especially at these most recent Cube events, because it exists in this intersection between a lot of different styles of cube, sharing part of its card pool with cubes that are very powerful, with cubes that are very synergistic, with cubes that are reasonably powerful but meaningfully taking a couple steps down from those power motivated lists. When people who are mostly playing those styles of lists try the cube, they always say something different. As an example piece of feedback, and the person who gave me this feedback was awesome, and we talked for a really long time. But Thassa's Oracle was in the cube for California Cube Chance, and someone gave me the feedback that they were looking for demonic consultation.
Right, the combo that you would expect.
Yeah, which I consider out of line for pretty much any cube that it's in, and I think it would be wildly busted in the Bodleian Cube. But I see where that feedback was coming from because that's their context. In the same way that someone who is looking at the cube from the perspective of, hey, this is a cube that's meaningfully eschewing some of the most powerful cards in Magic to make other cards shine, might see that Fable of the Mirror Breaker is in there and say, what gives? This is one of the most powerful red cards of all time. And to that, I would say, I actually think Fable is exactly the kind of power outlier that I want in this cube because there's enough good removal that Fable just makes your deck better at doing what it was already trying to do. And that's exciting. Fable's a sneaky card. Fable is going to be the reason that players lost, but it's not really obvious that Fable's the card that did it most of the time. Because usually another card is actually ending the game. Fable's just giving you mana to do it, helping you find it, copying it sometimes, which is powerful. But when you compare that to, again, a card like Minsc and Boo, any player can look and say, that hamster did 12 damage to me starting on turn 3. That's why I lost the game. That sucks. I like where a card like Fable or Demonic Tutor can provide that role in the cube. But that's something that I had to learn in this past month to some extent, was to make sure that I understood where people were coming from, so that I, don't feel, did I somehow signal that Demonic Consultation would be a reasonable card in this cube? And I think the answer is no, but I see why, based on the overlap in cards with cubes that might run that, someone could be looking for it, especially if they didn't read the overview particularly closely or look at the list before drafting.
Sure. I think a helpful piece of that too is that there are always going to be power outliers, no matter how hard we work to trim those down. And there's a value in that if it points you in a good direction, or as you've suggested, that it's a good piece of glue that makes other things work.
Yeah, that's a great point. You're going to have best cards in your cube no matter what. No matter how flat you think you've got in your cube, they're going to be best cards. So you can't just cut the cards people tell you are too good every single time. To tie it back into feedback, if you do that, there will just be best new cards. You need to curate your best cards so that they align with the goals of your cube and are helping you deliver that experience that you're looking to deliver.
Outstanding. That's a great word. Jake, by way of wrapping these things up, if you could have any card as a promo, what card would it be and who would you have do the illustration for it?
So that's a great question. I think I would do an old border printing of Blood Artist with Magali Villeneuve as the artist.
Oh, man. Yeah. So the retro frame, an important part of it here, it sounds like.
Yeah, I love Old Border, which is interesting because I didn't play Magic when Old Border was a thing. But I think an Old Border, I just really like Old Border cards, particularly black cards with the Old Border. And Magali is my favorite Magic artist, hands down. So I'd love to see that come together.
So I have some feedback for you.
Okay.
I had fun. This was good for me, and I appreciate you taking the time to do it.
Thank you. See, that's great feedback. You started with how you felt, and what happened.
Well, if
No,
folks would like to leave you similar feedback, perhaps, or maybe they want to learn more about Bodleian or any of your several other projects, where would be the best place to point them?
uh, very good question. And I also want to say I've had a blast with this. It's always a great time when we get to talk. So this has been great. So on Cube Cobra, I'm Deinonychus. I'm assuming Cade will link these.
Yes.
Write some articles with another friend of ours, Bones, on there too, where you can read some of my thoughts on cards. I am HGS Cube on Twitter, not super active, and I'm most active on Discords, where I am also at Deinonychus. And if you ping me, especially in the Bodleian Cube thread, I will talk to you maybe too much.
Well, this has indeed been a great time, and I always learn a lot when we get to chat together, and this has been no exception. Looking forward to connecting here soon at CubeCon and wherever else opportunity arises.
Absolutely. It's going to be great to get to see each other at CubeCon this year, and look forward to getting to keep chatting and maybe, get some more Roto matches in.
Oh, man. Yeah, Roto League is a topic for another time, perhaps.
Definitely.
Jake, thank you so much.
Thanks, Kate, for having me on.